Hello and welcome, everyone. I'm Natalia Kapitnik, Director of Communications at the Foreign Policy Research Institute. Thank you for joining us today for the third episode of our special series, The Continent, where we explore how the war in Ukraine is changing Europe's politics and security. Just a reminder that this discussion is being recorded and will be available along with our previous episodes on our website, www.fpri.org, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts, and also here on Twitter. So with that, we'll get started and I'll turn it over to our host, Aaron.
Good morning, afternoon, and evening. Welcome to The Continent. I'm your host, Aaron, and on this podcast, I'm exploring how the war in Ukraine is impacting politics, security, and societies across Europe. As Natalia just mentioned, if you're joining us for the first time, you can find prior recordings under FPRI's Chain Reaction podcast. Yeah, it's accessible just about everywhere you listen to podcasts. So far, I've spoken to local experts in Germany and Poland, and I'd encourage you to give those episodes a listen. Today, we're taking a turn up north to Sweden, which is moving to join NATO, and in doing so, has reevaluated a long-standing, and I mean centuries here, neutrality. Or has it? This episode comes at a special juncture, too. Not only was yesterday, June 6th, Sweden's National Day, so congrats to any Swedes in attendance today, but as we speak, Sweden is in the midst of a political crisis, this crisis itself in the midst of Sweden's NATO application. So many layers, and we're going to talk about cows today, too. Yes, you heard me right, stay tuned, we'll get there. A quick note, though. Given how kinetic the events we're talking about are, if you're joining after the live recording, today is June 7th, and it's about 11 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. Let's see how the situation unfolds between now and whatever it is you're joining us. So let's, if you will, sweeten the deal. Our guest today is Oscar Jonsson, and I have a great many questions for him. So let's jump to it. Oscar, if you'd mind, to tell us a bit about yourself.
Absolutely. Thank you very much for hosting me, Aaron. My name is Oscar. I'm a researcher on I have my PhD in war studies. I'm working on Russia, but also on Swedish defense and security policy. I've been working on these issues for well over a decade. I have been working at the Swedish Armed Forces headquarters. I've been running a think tank in Stockholm. I've been running a research center in Madrid. And I'm very happy and also a bit cautious before the task of explaining everything about Swedish security policy for the audience, because it barely makes sense if you understand everything about Swedish politics. But if you go and try to look from the outside and in, I mean, the challenge is even bigger. But I'm looking forward a lot trying to disassemble all the parts in this.
Well, I wish you the best of luck in doing so. We have a ton of questions ahead. Let's start at a very top level, though. One of the things I've tried to do on this podcast is keep the questions tied to the experiences of real people. And we were talking about this just the other day. I wanted to ask you how the war in Ukraine has impacted Swedish society with regards to how regular people are following it. We've obviously seen a shift in views about joining NATO, but are regular people talking about the war? What have you seen?
Yeah, absolutely, and I think that's a good desire to try to go beyond perhaps the expert bubble. And I mean, of course, given my background and work, I'm probably spending a lot of time with the minority working with defense and security. But I kind of asked around. I kind of looked at figures and statistics, and I do think it's very fair to say that it's had a really big impact on Swedish society. There's a big, strong boost in kind of this determination for defending Sweden. I mean, you mentioned NATO opinions, which is one of them, but also such things such as the National Guards have registered record numbers of people just wanting to sign up to do their parts. There's been a lot of private initiatives to support Ukraine. So I think it's Sweden, also probably for reasons of geographical proximity, has felt this very intensely. And I mean, Kiev is closer to Stockholm than Paris is. And I mean, Sweden was driving together with Poland the Eastern Partnership with the Eastern members, including Ukraine. So I think it's fair to say that it's really engulfed a whole of society, and has a strong kind of unequivocal support for Ukraine as well.
Very interesting to hear, especially that statistic about the National Guard. I hadn't heard that. Now, we have a lot of grounds to cover today, as we've talked about. Sweden's in the midst of a kind of crisis in government, which I think ties, whether or not it's caused by NATO, relates to this NATO application. Interesting timing there. Yeah. So before we dive into the cause of this crisis and what is actually happening with it, I wanted to ask what I've turned um, for I guess, American listeners predominantly the Mr. Rogers question: who are the people in your neighborhood? So I wanted to quickly run through with you, if you'd be so kind, um, kind of the political parties that kind of are meaningful players right now. We don't have to go through the entire platform, but for a non-expert like me. What do the parties need to be aware of? And kind of the follow-up question there, before all of this happened, was there a difference of views on Russia?
Yeah, okay. I think so. Sweden has a proportional system with 8 parties in parliament, and they kind of gravitated to two big constellations really throughout history. It's been the social democratic alternative that hold power for most of the last 120 years. It's only been one occasion of a non-social democratic government getting re-elected, and that was in 2010. They have been running together with the environmentalist party and the leftist former communist party. Now the other Green Party, the Center Libertarian Party, just kind of jumped to the social democratic side of the aisle. And then on the other hand, right now you have the moderate party, center right party, which is kind of the only party that's challenging the social democrats for government, and they are collaborating with the liberals, the Christian Democrats, and the Sweden Democrats, our own anti-immigration party. And yeah, sorry, the difference of views. Yeah, it's been actually since 2014. Sweden has been very united in the perception of Russia. There has been attempts on both the left and the right. With the Sweden Democrats has been plagued with having kind of pro-Putin spokesperson for defense. The Communist Party have their election platform, zero mentions of Russia and 120 of NATO and the US as imperialist, climate denying imperialist, etc. But all of that kind of crystallized after 2014 in a broad election of Russia is a threat. We should do something about it. I think it's been especially a process for the Sweden Democrats to put it on their election platform and say no, Russia is a threat, and try to avoid that. But they have a history which is not so stellar. Similarly, you had in the environmentalist party, not necessarily pro-Russian, but more of kind of the pacifists are wrong, which tends to lead to the US and NATO is more wrong. And I'm seeing we have among the audience the former defense spokesperson for the environmentalist party. So we could perhaps invite him up to give his take if he wants later as well. But broadly speaking, the 101 is this really kind of two main players, the Social Democratic Party and the Moderate Party. And they are the ones having the real governmental alternatives. And the support parties there have been varying the last decades of who's supporting who.
Great breakdown, very helpful for me. One of the things I saw in my cursory research for this episode is the fact that it looks like the current kind of in-government constellation has 175 seats in parliament, and the opposition has 174. So that is a close margin. We're going to get there when we start talking about this crisis. But one thing I wanted to just follow up on, and I read about this and wanted to ask how you've seen this in practice. Something that, as an American in a highly polarized political system right now, to see what looks like the parties basically come together and say, we're going to support this NATO accession in unison and not make it an election issue. Could you elaborate on that? Is that the correct understanding of what happened?
Yeah, it is. And I think Sweden has, it's funny because a lot of pundits in Sweden are saying, hey, polarization in politics are reaching American levels, which is actually silly. Sorry, no offense to Americans, but cooperation is, even though there's harsh words being exchanged, there's nowhere near that. And actually in security and defense, there's been a long-standing tradition with some few exceptions to actually take decisions with with broad agreement in parliament. So the NATO decision definitely fits that bill. It all happened very, very quickly. It happened incredibly quickly. I mean, the Social Democrats has been against NATO membership all the time, and NATO membership wasn't really a major issue on the political agenda. And I think, the Social Democrats didn't want to talk about it. and the center-right opposition was for it, but didn't really drive the question wholeheartedly. I mean, of course, they stated that they were for it. But so as late as March, our own prime minister said that the NATO application would be destabilizing. But then early April, the whole of the Social Democratic Party had in practice swung and said, let's join NATO. And in the same time, of course, notably, that didn't get that much attention. The Sweden Democrats also swung and said, yes, we need NATO. They've been against that earlier and been a bit more of, hey, US are imperialist. But very short amount of time, both the Sweden Democrats and Social Democrats, which are Social Democrats are 28%, Sweden Democrats are around 20% or something like that. So they are, together with the moderates, the three biggest parties, they all come in unison and kind of agreed, let's go through this delicate process together. And then, probably your next question.
Well, so one other question around that. We'll get to the crisis, we'll get to cows, but a quick follow-up that I guess one of the fun things about doing this podcast is hearing what people in different places have said, comparing and contrasting the views of specialists from different countries. So in Poland, they said the kind of looming Russian threat is not new. That's kind of been something at play since, how many centuries has that been the case? For Germany, on the other hand, my guest said that Russia was viewed as a threat for the first time in about 30 years. Does Russia seem like a looming danger to Sweden? There was an incident recently that seems kind of shady, maybe suspicious, where Russia may or may not have flown a plane armed with a nuclear weapon directly towards Sweden. But let's step back. Do you feel that the country is threatened? And anything to say about that incident? That was a kind of eye-opening event.
Yeah, absolutely. No, I think in Sweden there's kind of never been that big of a confusion that Russia is the threat. I mean, we after all fought 21 wars against Russia throughout history, 23 against the Danes, in case you're wondering, but still an honorable second place there for Russia. But it has dropped on the radar, and just to give you one example of the depth in which the Russia threat and also defense and security in general dropped was in 2004. We abandoned all defense planning in Sweden. That means kind of any notion that we will need to territorially defend Sweden, we gave up. Burnt the plans, filled all the bunkers, took away the coastal defense artillery. Kind of things that 10 years later it seems obvious that we should have needed, but that also underlines another peculiarity with Sweden, which is it's almost hard to forget. But I think Sweden is it's not that we didn't forget about Russia, but we're also one of the most kind of modern country in the sense of we're very quick to give up on history. History is never a big part of Swedish political dialogue. We're always looking ahead and very little looking back. So we're also used to do very, very quick kind of radical changes in policy in a number of perspectives. And I think that kind of Russia policy of the, within quotation marks, the Cold War kind of went out a little way. I mean, it did across Europe, of course. But as Swedes, we always do it more than, of course, Finland is always a good contrary indicator where, they have Europe's second largest artillery because they remember that they are in Russia's neighborhood. So I think that part kind of hit us, but Russia has always been there, so to speak.
Noted. Now you mentioned, and I think this is great timing and a great segue for word of the day, sharp radical turns. And on this podcast, I'm hoping to, as a outed devout language nerd, learn some new words. The word of the day that you suggested is cows. So tell us this word and how it fits into the current news environment.
Yes. No, the word of the day is kovändning, which means literally cow turn. And that ties into the German word of the day, which was Zeitenwende, which was the turn of the time. And I think Sweden did the same thing, but the kovändning is a lot more filled of panic. It's a lot more last minute. And I think that epitomizes the NATO process. I mean, Finland started making these steps already in December, and early during the spring they were decided. They made a meticulous diplomatic legwork of going around speaking to all of the NATO member states to deal a Finnish NATO application favorably, whereas we had in Sweden, we're still sitting and debating what we should do. And as I said, I mean, the prime minister just in March saying that a NATO application would be destabilizing, and that we should not, should radically alter our security policy in these dire circumstances. This will be after the onset of the war. But then all of a sudden, as often in Swedish policy, we do a kovändning, we do a 180-degree turn. And then everyone is agreeing that obviously the new policy was the only thing that ever was correct to do. So I think it's fair to add that this radical turn was not, preceded by months of careful debate and deliberation of how do we best do this, but rather first very strong resistance, and then all of a sudden everyone was in favor, and Swedish political life followed accordingly.
Great word. I'm excited to learn that. And now, listeners, you know how cows have to, what cows have to do with all of this. So we've been tiptoeing around this ongoing political crisis. I saw today that before we say what happened, I will give opportunity to basically explain what happened with I believe it's the justice minister specifically. Basically want to understand kind of narrative, what is happening with this, potential fall of governments, which looks not to have happened yet, spoiler alert, and then how that maybe impacts NATO accession, which has to do with Turkey, which is another spoiler, going to have to be an episode in its own right. But let's talk with this potential vote against the justice minister. First of all, what happens there?
Yeah, so the constitutional committee in parliament, they read a number of errands, and the justice minister got a lot of, I don't know what the technical term is, but the constitutional committee struck him down on a number of instances. He had, among other things, lied and provided deceiving material information, and in a number of errands. And after that, Sweden Democrats said, we want to vote of no confidence in the justice minister. And a number of parties, the moderate party government coalition, all of them said, great, we don't have any confidence in the justice minister, we'll go ahead with it. The prime minister said, if the justice minister falls, I will abandon my whole government. I will, I'll throw in my resignation if this happens. And the plot twist is that it's not 174 against and 175 in favor. Actually, the two parts are divided, 174 versus 174. And the deciding vote, out of a complete irony, which is the ruling government is ruling based on its governmental support, plus a vote from what is called a political wild, which is a member of parliament that resigned from the leftist party, is now acting in her own capacity. And she, as a complete plot twist, was a Peshmerga fighter for the Kurds. So in November, when the government stepped into office, they negotiated an individual deal with this political wild that included a lot of support for Kurdish movement, as she is being Kurdish. So now we're in a situation where Erdogan is holding the veto against Sweden and Finland and joining NATO, and the Swedish prime minister is appointed by one deciding vote, which is from a Kurdish Peshmerga, which obviously Erdogan feels so about. So that's that shaky parliamentary support for the government that moved ahead with a vote today, the vote of no confidence regarding the justice minister. And up until the last minute, the outcome was uncertain because, again, the political wild, Amineh Kakabaveh, was negotiating unilaterally with the government that they should honor all the promises that they've given to her and the support for Kurdish movements. I don't have the exact details of the full one here. At the same time, we're, on the other hand, sitting with Erdogan trying to negotiate ways of him accepting a Swedish application into NATO. The Social Democrats restated their promise to Kakabaveh, and the vote of no confidence only gathered 174 votes. They needed 175, and thus the government continues until September 11th, when we have our next election.
I sometimes find myself wondering, why was I working on politics and events like this that are, so many layers and so much irony and frankly juiciness is a great reminder. This is a heck of a dramatic situation.
Yeah,
Now, I
especially, I mean,
want
imagine that in November. I mean, imagine that in November you need to get the support of one Kurdish former Peshmerga, and you're like, okay, let's promise whatever, and then all of a sudden you're gonna have to join NATO with Erdogan as the major obstacle. That's really what you would call a plot twist.
I would say so, indeed, putting it very mildly. Now, one thing I'm wondering about here, we talked about how the parties have a fair degree of alignment. You know, I'm sure they'll find issues to fight with each other on as the election comes, disagreements, points of contention. But you said that there was a pretty clear consensus on NATO. So do you think, now, barring what Erdogan does, and again, I feel like in talking this through, I'm going to need to dedicate an entire episode to Turkey, what Erdogan wants. But do you see this election as having the potential to derail or end Sweden's NATO accession?
No, not at all. I mean, I think that the support is so widespread. It's 90% of parliament, 88% of parliament that is in favor of NATO, and the governmental crisis hasn't changed that. So I'm more worried actually about Erdogan's reaction, and I think that, as always, as many cases before, a lot of that is fluff, and a lot of that is bargaining. And he has a history of trying to get a lot of things on the table, and a lot of those are actually not directed against Sweden and Finland. It's directed against the U.S., including being cancelled from the F-35 program, or not getting Patriot air defense missile systems, and other things. So, I don't see the election derailing the NATO application in any way, but I'm more worried about how Erdogan will react.
Yeah, I think many people are. You're not alone in wondering, or even wondering what his angle is. So I think that's a great primer on the ongoing crisis, which we will be continuing to follow. Looks like, I don't want to say it's subsided. Those could be famous last words, but it seems maybe it's reached a head for now, and we'll see how that evolves. I want to talk about security issues, though, and specifically, I know Sweden happens to have a very advanced and developed military-industrial complex. I see a fair few Saab fighters among the avatars of listeners with us today. But let's start with the kind of alliances and entanglements level here. Now, I said that in moving to join NATO, Sweden was leaving centuries of neutrality. That's the kind of contention I would make. But at the same time, Sweden's had security entanglements with the EU. So does joining NATO, if this happens, if Erdogan gives it the thumbs up, does Sweden joining NATO actually mean a big change for Sweden's military or defense posture?
The short answer is no. The long answer is a little bit funnier. I think that I want to rewind all the way back to Sweden's nuclear weapons program in the 50s and 60s, which I'm sure all of you are aware of. But let me just restate the fundamentals. After the Second World War, Sweden, who stayed outside as technically neutral, but also managed to survive by giving up on the neutrality first to Nazi Germany by allowing troop transport and other things. And then when the war turned, giving up to neutrality to the other side, to the Allies, for troop transport and other ways. But since the Second World War, we had secret military cooperation with the US. And when we're in the midst of using our great engineers to build nuclear weapons program, actually in 1962, the State Secretary of Defense stood up and said, guys, should we not just abandon this? We're under US nuclear umbrella anyways. And everybody nodded and said, yeah, you're right. Why should we get our own nuclear weapon? Because we're with the US anyways. So among the top political leadership in Sweden, there's always been kind of this two-level game. On the one hand, we had secret military cooperation, but on the other one, we had a declared neutrality, which would allow us to, quote unquote, stand neutral between the two superpowers and criticize everyone. But in practice, we were closely aligned with our Western partners. But that was not that known more broadly. But fast forward to 1995, we joined a political union, and that kind of was the death of neutrality. Since then, the technical term has been alliance-free, if you were in favor of it, or alliance-less, if you were against it. But fast forward even further, the last, I would say, 2 decades, we've done kind of everything we can to integrate into NATO, because being outside NATO, you need to stay relevant if you are dependent on NATO, which we, and as I said, gave away all notion of territorial defense of Sweden in 2004. We participated in NATO operations in the Balkans, in Afghanistan, in Libya, etc., and we, contributed with capabilities more significant than many NATO states. So actually, I would describe the latest, 2 decades of still having to be super relevant to NATO because we were very dependent on NATO. And then, one of the crown jewels is in 2016, we signed a host nation support agreement, which gives the actual legal basis for NATO troops operating from Swedish territory. So us taking the step to full membership is rather a change in I would say public perception than in practice if you have been working with any of these questions.
So before we talk about the military specifically, putting my Russia specialist hat on, if you're Russia, if you're Putin, does this actually change anything? I think actually Sergei Lavrov, Russia's foreign minister, said it doesn't really change much. What's your read on that?
Yeah, so on the one hand, you have actually President Putin himself saying this doesn't change much. What we care about is military infrastructure, and if that builds up, then we'll need to respond accordingly. But on the other hand, you have Sergei Ryabkov, deputy foreign minister, saying this is significant and will have wide-reaching consequences. And I think, very blatantly, I would read Putin's statement as knows that, first of all, he's aware of where our alignment is. Secondly, he cannot do much that could have a strategic impact on Sweden's NATO process. I'm sure Russia will try to attempt something, but nothing significantly. So I do think it's internal expectation management for the own elite of recognizing that, hey, we can actually not do that much about it. This is actually not a big of a threat. Whereas the days leading up to Sweden's NATO decision, had Sakharova, speaking about nuclear weapons, putting nuclear weapons in Kaliningrad, which there probably are nuclear weapons in Kaliningrad already. But you had very aggressive posturing. But at the same time, of course, NATO expansion is a problem. NATO is the biggest obstacle for aggression. So any kind of NATO expansion seems from the Russian leadership as a big blowback, and therefore they need to kind of act a little bit tough, but also by deterring anyone else who would be potentially interested in joining NATO. So I think we will see something. You had the Finnish head of intelligence speaking in Financial Times yesterday, I think, where he said, "We're quite surprised. We haven't seen that much yet. We have seen some, minor nuisance." But nothing real so far. And we're talking about DDoS attacks on like governmental web pages, and that is a huge problem if you, like me, as a researcher, need to find a document on the government's web page. But for the rest of the people, you don't go to the government.org that often, and that's not a significant drawback in any way.
Yeah, great points. Yes, and it was Putin, not Lavrov. Maybe even a better signal of intent, but I would agree with your read. Now, let's talk about, and we've actually made it through. This is the final question I have. Great job answering all of these very technical narrative questions about crisis and the like. So 2 questions. Let's start with, we've looked about or thought about here NATO mean to Sweden. Let's turn that around. As I mentioned, Sweden, as best I'm tracking, has a fairly well-developed military-industrial complex. So what does Sweden bring to the table for NATO?
Yeah, I think probably 3 or 4 things, and I'll start with military-industrial complex. I started with, and Sweden is one of very few medium-sized states, or some might even call it a small-sized state that has its own fighter jet program, and we're building quite capable fighters. But more importantly, we're using the fighters ourselves. But the interesting part is what Sweden brings to NATO is something probably that the UK and the US will be happy about, because our defense industrial complex is very tied together with American and British companies. So within the EU, you have France and Germany trying to create a much closer defense industrial cooperation in Europe, really trying to shield off third-party countries such as the UK and the US. where Sweden's defense industry is very tied to the US and the UK there. But I think defense industry is one. I mean, we all seen, what else can be done, which is also a Swedish-British product. We have great submarines, and we have also competent artillery, which we haven't sent to Ukraine yet, but maybe that will come. So very strong defense industry. Second, I would say would be first, the most important thing is our geography. If NATO is to fulfill Article 5 truly and defend the Baltic states, that will inevitably involve Swedish territory. And all the better if that, of course, is prepared in advance, that you have defense planning exercises and all the preconditions for doing so. But also, of course, really is creating a coherent strategic entity in the north. Sweden has done quite deep defense cooperation with Norway and Denmark, but it always reaches a point where us not being a part of NATO really puts a hinder to that. So I think you would also get a stronger Nordic NATO instead of just having Denmark and Norway in there, whereas now you have a bloc with very similar values that are able to work together. Third part, I would say our Air Force. Ours is very competent. The Gripens are a very field-worthy, multi-role aircraft that can do everything from starting from highways for dispersion. They don't need big air bases. But also, what is probably less known is our intelligence cooperation. This also comes back to the Second World War, where because Germany was operating from Swedish territory, a lot of signals was passing Swedish territory, and we had cryptographic pioneers that managed to eavesdrop on a lot of German military communication, which gave us good insight to where they are. But since then, we built strong intelligence complex, especially apt at understanding Russia. I remember a decade ago looking into this, 70% of Russia's internet cables were physically passing through Swedish territory, which also has given us a ground of real influence in DC, because we had very good Russian intelligence, which we've been cooperating with the US with. And maybe that's even a broader point, that our Russian knowledge has a strong history, which I think it's has a high quality if you compare across the board of states that have a good Russian knowledge. And we can dive deeper into that, where that comes from, if you want.
Why not? Let's talk more about it. I think that's going to be a topic as well in next episode. Spoiler alert, which will be Finland, but more coming on that soon. For a few minutes, talk about this intel element and familiarity with Russia.
Yeah, well, a lot of it is centered around the Swedish Military Interpreter School, which was an elite school for conscription, focusing on Russia. And that kind of gave the personnel, both for ministry, to our intelligence services, but also to our business elites, actually. A lot of those studying there went on to Swedish societal life. And also during the mid-2000s, when most states were just cutting down on their Russian knowledge, the defense ministry funded the Swedish Defense Research Institute, which has been a big research program that coherently has put out every third year. They've been putting out Russian military capability in a 10-year analysis. And they really had a critical mass to be a research program. 8 to 10 researchers sitting together, doing this over time, refining the methodology, at a time when really the rest of the world was just dismantling Russian institutions. So that's a short story. We kind of kept it, we kind of had it, and it goes throughout the state apparatus in kind of many ways and shapes and forms.
Glad you mentioned this. I think the intel element in particular is something I hadn't thought about, so excited to have learned about that. Let's arrive at our last question overall, but for this topic. To contrast with Germany down to the south here, one of the topics we addressed at length in the Germany episode was about how Germany's military was allowed to essentially, after the Cold War hollow out, was underinvested in. A lot of on-paper capabilities that will need to be basically rebuilt as Germany reinvests in its military. I apologize for any ignorance of mine, or not any. I apologize for my ignorance on the topic. As Sweden looks to join NATO, are there areas that have been underinvested? Where does Sweden stand as far as this oft-mentioned 2% spending for defense for NATO? What is the status and readiness of the military these days?
Yeah, Aaron, no need to apologize. I spent plus arguing for bigger defense spending. So that's a question right up my alley. No, I think that it's important to keep two thoughts in your head at the same time, and one of them is being within certain areas we are having state-of-the-art capability. I mentioned Gripen and their air-to-air missiles, submarines. Also, our corvettes are quite good. Our artillery. But there's really a problem in terms of size and in terms of kind of making the whole thing better. So with the downsizing, we went around 2000, we were spending 2% of GDP. I think we bottomed at 1.1% of GDP 1 or 2 years ago. We kind of had really good high-end capabilities, which we used in NATO operations. But the Ukraine is painfully showing how much also is about endurance, how much is about logistic, how much is about ammunition. And Finland has really chose a different philosophy there. And I think it's obviously a clever one, but they did not go for, let's get the best and most expensive kit in small numbers, but let's get something that is cheap, works, and let's get them in great numbers. So I think for the territorial scenario, and again, as I said, we gave up all kinds of a territorial defense. And so that also, of course, explains why we can have 8 Gripens participating in Libya and doing a great job. But the question is, what happens when you need 80 or 160? So in a way, I would say our best capabilities are better than the Germans, but we have a similar problematic where our current defense spending is something around 1.2, maybe 1.3%. But there is a broad-based political agreement to radically increase it to 2%. I think the government wants to do it by 2028 and the opposition by 2026. So you will see a very, very significant increase very, very soon. But the crux of military capability is that it takes a long time to build. Let's say order air defense system, and the procurement take 3 years, and then you need a year to train the soldier, and then you need to train the soldiers with the system, with other systems, etc. So, I think readiness capability is good, but the numbers will need to expand, and that's what we're going to do. And I hope it quickly enough. I think that's my overall take.
Yeah, I think if there's anything that's been learned in Ukraine so far, it's that interstate war is really nasty and attrition happens, and that logistics are a thing. You can't just buy 80 fighter jets immediately and then receive them the next day.
It's like COVID. When you need masks, the rest of the world need masks. When you need defense material, the rest of the world needs it. I mean, just to give one example, the UK said it would take them 3 to 4 years just to replenish all the NLAWs they sent to Ukraine. And now we're speaking of existing production lines. But then also the UK wants more NLAWs than when the war started. So defense procurement takes a lot of time.
Yeah, I mean, I know in the US, we're right now don't have a way to build more Stinger missiles present. Yeah. So very key concerns. Oscar, I want to thank you so much for joining today. I learned a lot, and I hope that the listeners did too. It was a pleasure to have you by.
Yeah, no worries. Thank you very much for hosting me, and I hope I managed to bring at least a little bit of light on topics that it's hard to comprehend even for myself.
You absolutely did. I'll turn it back over to FPRI to close us out, but thanks to all of you for joining today.
Thanks, Aaron, and thank you, Oscar, for this great discussion. To all of our listeners for joining us. As a reminder, if you missed any part of the discussion, the recording will be available shortly here on Twitter. And if you're interested in more on Sweden, be sure to also check out last week's Chain Reaction episode with FPRI's Director of Research, Aaron Stein, for a deep dive on Sweden's troubles with Turkey. And as always, to explore more from FPRI's research, podcasts, and upcoming events, be sure to visit us on www.fpri.org. Until next time.